My name is Matt Kirchner. This is the Tech Ed Podcast. So excited for this particular episode of the podcast. My guest, who we're going to introduce in just a moment, is someone for whom I have tremendous respect. He's a very, very well-known journalist. Before we get to that, I want to tell you that I have three loves, probably more than three, but particular to this episode, we'll leave it at three. Number one, we all know I love STEM education. Number two, we all know I love technical education. And number three, you may not know that I absolutely love the sport of cycling. And we are on the eve of just the most incredible 3 weeks in the sport of cycling. It's called the Tour de France. It runs from July 5th to July 27th. I get so excited this time of year to watch bike racing, and I am so excited to introduce the sport that I love to our audience of the Tech Ed Podcast in a way that's going to be really interesting. We're going to do a few things. In just a moment, I'll be introducing our guest, and he and I are going to break down the first part of the episode. We'll be talking about the Tour de France. What is the Tour de France? What's it all about? There's all these different things that are going on during these 21 stages of racing, so we're going to explain all that to the audience. In the second half of this episode, I'm going to give you some thoughts on this year's tour, and I've got plenty of them. We're also going to talk about just all the technology and all the STEM-related things that are going on inside the Tour de France while these 21 stages of racing, these 23 days of July are taking place. And so we're going to cover that as well. So to help me out with the first half of that, to introduce our audience to the Tour de France, somebody I just, like I mentioned, have a great deal of respect for. He is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. His name is Jason Gay. I follow his column. I read every single one of his columns. A great, great journalist. He has an incredible ability, by the way, to take really complex sporting things and break them down into simple bite-sized pieces that anybody can understand. He has a gift. And I will just say this, I can read a Jason Gay column about a sport that I know a lot about. Let's talk about Major League Baseball, NFL football, cycling. We're going to talk about that. And I can read a Jason Gay column about that. And it's just like, oh my goodness, this all makes sense to me. What a great writer. And then I can read a column about something like the game of lacrosse. I mean, nothing wrong, nothing against lacrosse. I just don't know anything about that sport. But I read a column about college lacrosse authored by Jason Gay, and he has a way to speak to me even about a sport that I don't know anything about. That is a true gift, and you're going to see it on display here on this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast, talking about the sport of cycling. So it's really, really a pleasure to welcome to the studio of the Tech Ed Podcast from the Wall Street Journal, Jason Gay. Jason, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and thank you very much for having me. And I had to chuckle at the top of when you said that, don't worry, we're going to explain bike racing for you, in a podcast that handles both STEM and tech, that it would be bike racing, which would be the impenetrable topic. But I totally understand where you're coming from, because for a lot of people, they just kind of stare at the screen and wonder what the heck's going on. So thrilled to be part of all this.
Absolutely. I can't think of any greater topic, and I can't think of any greater guest to talk about that with, because I know you're a huge fan of cycling, as am I. I also just have to mention, I've been a reader of your column for a number of years, long time. You're a phenomenal journalist. Love your stuff. You also were terrific. I actually had the opportunity to go back and listen to. Unfortunately, I wasn't in the audience for your commencement address at your alma mater, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but it was absolutely terrific. So first you're like this amazing columnist, then you get to deliver this commencement address to an audience of 50,000 people, and now you're joining me on the Tech Ed Podcast. I mean, your career has really taken off. It's just absolutely incredible.
First of all, thank you very much. Yeah, the Madison thing was a huge honor. I can only imagine how many people must have said no before they got to my name low down the list, but it was a real pleasure to get to spend a weekend in Madison and meet all those great graduates and families. And, it's one of the great places on earth, Madison, Wisconsin, and very close to my heart. So it was such a privilege to be there.
It's incredibly, incredibly special. And I think, as you know, both my kids are Badgers, so I spent a lot of time in Madison while they were going to school. I've been actually a football season ticket holder for years and years and years. And I might as well plug our amazing producer, Melissa Martin, as well, for as long as we're on the topic, who, believe it or not, was a cheerleader at the University of Wisconsin-Madison before she even got to this incredibly high post as the producer of the Tech Ed podcast. So we're all in good company, and good company, by the way, talking about this topic that you and I hold so dear. We're heading into the Tour de France. For me, it is like I'm a longtime baseball fan. You think about the World Series, or for that matter, you think about the Super Bowl. This is the Super Bowl of cycling, but instead of it being like a best of 7 or a single Sunday afternoon, we are talking about 21 stages, 23 days of racing, starting on July 5th, wrapping up on July 27th. Do you get as giddy as I do this time of year for the Tour?
I absolutely do, but I want to just go back to something you mentioned a moment ago. So Melissa is a real Badger, is what you're saying, and you and I are just pretenders. I mean, she was actually on the field as a talent, and you and I are just goofing off as fans. I hope you're not going to tell me at the end of this broadcast that Melissa also rode in the Tour de France. Is that going to happen?
Well, we're setting her up, right? I think the first step is for her to understand the sport in the first place, right? So we're going to explain to her in the same way we're going to explain to our audience what this thing, the Tour de France, is, because when you break it down, it becomes somewhat understandable, but it is a little bit complicated as we get started. What's on your mind as we're heading into this year's Tour?
I agree with all that. I do think that it's a sport that offers almost anyone something. You know, the most casual fan, the person who is showing up to the first time, the person who is tuning into it for the first time, the person who has been obsessing about it like you have for decades now. There's always a little bit of something for it. You mentioned the Super Bowl. I heard the Tour de France characterized once as the Super Bowl, 21 times over 3 weeks. And it's a pretty accurate representation of what it is. I mean, it is a massive event, the scale of it, the amount of people who come to it, just the apparatus it takes to get underway, and just the incredible enthusiasm that exists across the country for it. It's quite different than almost anything else. And, cycling has other grand tours, of course, in Italy and Spain, but the Tour de France is the granddaddy of them all, like they used to say about the Rose Bowl. And it endures. This was something that was begun as a publicity stunt many, 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 many years ago.
Right.
And it has, endured world wars. It has endured stoppages. It endured scandal after scandal after scandal. And yet here we still are getting excited about it. And this year's race, has no shortage of drama in it. To begin there, I think the obvious thing is whether or not we are going to see what has evolved into a spectacular duel over the last number of years between two riders, Tadej Pogačar, who is from Slovenia, and a rider named Jonas Vingegaard, who is from Denmark. And both are Tour de France winners in the past. Tadej is defending champ. He had won 2 before that. And these guys have just been kind of going at it with sticks for the last half decade now. And hopefully we're going to get that kind of duel again, because it's been as good as it gets in the last few.
Absolutely. And there's so much anticipation about this tour, and a huge part for that reason. And I think, you think back to 2020, and we'll get into some of these details for the audience that may not be as familiar with the tour, but 2020, when, Tadej Pogačar kind of came of age, everybody was thinking at that point that Primož Roglič was kind of had the tour in the bag, or at least had the pole position, if you will, on the yellow jersey. And then Pogačar late in the game comes out of nowhere and takes it from him. Both Slovenians, by the way, countrymen, and Tadej, steps up top the top of the podium at the end of the tour, and then this rivalry that has been created over the course of the last half decade, as you say, between Tadej Pogačar and Jonas Vingegaard, the former fishmonger, by the way.
That's
I love
right.
that. I'm not even sure what a fishmonger does, but that's what he was before he stepped back into cycling. Just some amazing stories, and then we've got some other riders that I know we want to talk about. So many stories to tell, but let's talk about the tour just in general. I think, Jason, you're exactly right. Something for everybody. Let's start with, even if you know nothing or could care less about bike racing, if you're into castles, if you're into French chateaus, beautiful landscapes. I mean, you could just sit and watch the tour and these amazing helicopter shots just for that reason. You agree?
Oh, that's right. If you like helicopter shots of windmills and turrets and things like that, the Tour de France is for you. It is really kind of like watching a Chamber of Commerce video for the country of France. It's a remarkable display of the beauty of the countryside, stretching from all over the country and going into multiple mountain ranges. I know people who watch it literally for the aesthetic of it, just to kind of have it on in the background. Then there's the race itself, and it's, this is a cliche you'll hear quite a bit with cycling, is there's the race within the race within the race. And
Right.
by that, we mean that there's this overall competition, which is what we were alluding to with Pogačar and Vingegaard. That is for the yellow jersey. That's the most prestigious thing you can win at Tour de France. That is the overall winner. That is the person who finishes the race with the lowest composite time across all of the stages. And that can do that by, winning big on one day or taking a little bit another day, winning it in time trials, winning it in mountains. Typically, what that yellow jersey means is that you are the best overall rider in the field. You are great in the mountains. You are good as a time trialist. You don't get left behind in the sprints.
Let's break that down for just a little bit, though. So we're talking about, the overall, we call it the GC or the yellow jersey or the general classification, the fastest overall time through the entire tour, which is 21 stages. So just for our audience that may not be fully familiar with the tour, 21 stages throughout, in this case, all within the country of France. Every once in a while, in fact, quite often, it'll go outside the borders of France into places like Italy and Belgium and the Netherlands. This year, the entire tour, every stage is inside of the country of France. And so every one of these stages is its own individual race, and they're basically accumulating time over the course of the 21 stages.
Yes. And, this is where people sometimes get lost a little bit, is that, each day there is a stage winner. So there is a stage, and that is winnable by anyone. And then there is a competition called, as you said, the GC, and that is for the overall race leader. And that's the person who, if you take their time from stage 1 and add it to their time for stage 2 and add to their time for stage 3, it is the lowest total overall. And then everybody is kind of up from that. Second place is X amount of seconds behind. Third place is X amount of seconds behind. Sometimes we've seen races, we've seen tours that are decided, over 3 weeks by a matter of seconds. We've seen, double-digit minute leads. Guys used to win these things by hours way
Right.
back when. The race has evolved spectacularly. It's incredibly competitive, of course. And as you alluded to, there's multiple dynamics involving teams, involving ways that, guys can work with each other to achieve things on a day or over the course of the tour itself. And so there's all this kind of internecine drama that happens in the Tour de France, which makes it very, very interesting for serious fans, but also I think it has a real appeal to people who are coming into the sport new, because there's nothing quite like it. There's no other sport that rewards, simultaneously both the long time effort and the individual one day within the hour type of performance that you see with the Tour de France. It's a real rarity in the way it's constructed. And that's what makes it, I think, really engaging over that period of time, and why people miss it, frankly. I mean,
Right.
It feels like you're losing an appendage when this thing finally ends
totally
in the middle
agree.
of July.
I know. Yeah, you get to, July 28th is the day, and it happens to be every year where it's like, I watch I say bell to bell. I watch every single stage, all 21 stages. Some of these can be, 3, 4, 5 hours long. I'm not going to say I'll never fast forward through, if they're on some 30-kilometer stretch that is just, flat riding through wheat fields or whatever. I might kind of hit the fast forward a little bit and watch for a crash or watch for some drama. But I watch every single moment of the Tour de France. And to kind of put this into perspective, again, for people who aren't familiar with it, you think about these stages. I think the shortest stage this year is a mountain time trial stage. That's about 11 kilometers, so call that 6.5 miles, give or take, is the shortest. And the longest one, stage 2, is 131 miles. And so, these guys are on and off these bikes every day. They get 2 rest days, I think, in between the 23 total days of the tour, in between the 21 stages. And so it really is. And no 2 stages are alike, is correct? I mean, talk a little bit about the variation in terms of what people might see stage to stage.
Yeah, I mean, when the people are putting together the race, when the race directors are putting together this map of what the stages will be, they're interested in two things. More than two things, but let's focus on these two. They're interested in obviously going all over the country, which is what the Tour de France typically does. It's always going to hit the mountains. It's always going to hit Paris. But it really makes the rounds around the countryside. And then the second thing they're trying to do is to determine, who is that best overall rider. And the way that you do that is you send them up hills, you send them down hills, you send them up mountains, you send them down mountains, you do flat stages, you do individual time trial stages, which is that everyone just starts on their own and they just race against the clock. Sometimes you do these team time trials where an entire team will go out and rotate, trying to achieve the fastest time as a team. That's an interesting wrinkle. And so what you're really trying to do is just, almost in the same way you do a decathlon and you try to determine the best overall athlete at an Olympic Games. This is sort of the decathlon of cycling in that you're going to be tested in almost every regard. It's very hard to win the Tour de France if you're not good at climbing mountains. I will say that. That just really will not happen for you. However, you can't just exclusively be a mountain climber. You do have to show some ability to hang with people when the speeds go up on the flats and when you do the time trials and things like that. So that's really the idea of the construction of the race.
Absolutely, and it's just fascinating to watch these different stages. I personally love, maybe most people do, the mountain stages. And we've got some great mountain stages both in the Pyrenees and the Alps this year. So that's going to be just amazing to watch. We've also got, in addition to the yellow jersey, we're going to go deeper on that one here in a moment, other races going on at the same time, right? So we've got different colored jerseys, the GC, the general classification, that's the yellow jersey competition. Let's start with the green jersey. So educate our audience on what the green jersey competition is all about.
I mean, the green jersey is supposed to determine the fastest rider in the race, in the respect of top end speed, who's the speediest person in the sprints, the dead ahead kind of racing that people enjoy watching. The points jersey, it's the green jersey. You win it by winning races, of course, but also winning what are called intermediate sprints. You'll see throughout races, there'll be little checkpoints set up along the way where racers will be able to achieve points by going out and sprinting ahead of the group. And so that's the green jersey. And then in addition to that, we have the polka dot jersey, which is the best climber of the race. And that is very simple. That is the person who's been getting up the climbs faster than anybody. Sometimes that's the yellow jersey winner. Sometimes the best climber in the race is also the polka dot jersey winner, but not always. We've seen sometimes that you have people who are just really good mountain goats and not very good at anything else, and they might be a polka dot jersey winner, but they're not necessarily yellow jersey material.
Exactly. And so you've got the green jersey like you talked about, and I love the sprint stages along the way. Sprint finishes too. We'll probably get into that. That's absolutely fascinating, and the speeds that these folks reach as they're barreling toward the finish line are just incredible. All the strategy that goes into the polka dot jersey, and as you mentioned, obviously you're not going to probably contend for the GC unless you're also an amazing climber, and so a lot of times that ends up being the same person. Sometimes it doesn't. Then we have the white jersey. That's the other competition going on. So tell us about the best young rider.
That's pretty straightforward. It is the best young rider. I believe it is 23 and under. Am I right about that, Matt?
It might be 25.
Oh, it's 25? Okay.
It might be 23 or 25.
I think I have soccer brain because soccer does 23U. So, yeah, I mean, it is.
And I could be wrong too, but either way, best young rider.
We can both agree to be half right. Either way, 25 or 23, it is the jersey given to the winner, or the fastest rider in the overall in that age maximum group. Many times, including for both Tadej Pogačar and I believe for Jonas Vingegaard, they have won it as the best young rider and won the yellow jersey. So it is not terribly uncommon to see young riders. And this is something that's been interesting to see evolve in cycling, that there was this consensus not terribly long ago that cycling was a sport in which you sort of came of age, you became your best cycling self in your late 20s, maybe even your early 30s. And young riders are coming into the sport now and defying that, and they are out of the box, really, really spectacular. And we've seen that with both Pogačar, Vingegaard, and a whole bunch of others.
Well, that's been really fascinating. You think about just sports in general. You tend to be able to some of these, some of these sports where endurance is so important. You can stay strong, well into your 30s and in some cases your 40s because especially the male body doesn't necessarily mature in that regard until a little bit later, especially in terms of endurance. My son was a bike racer growing up, and it was interesting. We always had to focus so much on making sure he stayed fueled up and making sure that he was taking in his energy along the way because it's so easy to do what they say bonk. That's another cycling term, but early if you're not really fueling your body, and yet now we've got these younger riders like Pogačar, who I think he's 26 now, so he would have been 21 when he won his first tour, and able to withstand that incredible, grueling 21 days of cycling. So we've got all four of these jerseys, 4 races going on at the same time. And I've introduced lots and lots of people to cycling. It's one of the tickets to hanging out with Matt Kirchner in July, for the most part, unless it's Independence Day, is that we're watching bike racing, right? So yeah, you're welcome to come over. We can have a beer, we'll hang out, but we're going to be watching the tour. And so I've had a lot of friends. I'm sure you've done the same thing, where they come and they stop and you're chit chatting, and then they get interested, and then they're asking questions. One of the things that they're most fascinated by that I think nobody realizes is the insane amount of strategy that goes into winning the GC, for instance, and being that overall fastest rider. So talk a little bit about what's going on within this team dynamic. We haven't touched on that either yet, is that we've got a whole bunch of teams. So we've got these individual riders. Let's talk about that first. They're all riding on an individual team. So what is this team dynamic? Who are these teams that these riders are riding for?
Yeah, this is the wrinkle that I think is sometimes the most complicated for a newcomer to race, to understand that it's not just simply an individual sport. It's not like watching a marathon where, everybody is kind of out for themselves. You have teams, and the teams have multiple jobs over the course of a grand tour like the Tour de France. Some riders are out there to win individual stages of their own. Sometimes you have a great sprinter who's trying to win the green jersey. You might have a great climber who's trying to win polka dots. But by and large, most teams have a GC contender whom they are trying to ride for. And cycling has a term which is a very sort of old-fashioned term called domestique, which is literally, servant to. And it is the role of these team riders to ride in support, in service of that that GC yellow jersey contender. How do they do that? Well, multiple things. They can ride in front of your Grand Tour contender and create sort of an aerodynamic pocket and give them actually a little bit of an easier day in the saddle. Now, this is something that I'm sure is near and dear to your heart because it involves science and technology and all that kind of stuff. But aerodynamics are a huge part of bicycle racing because, we've seen repeatedly studies that show that the individual who is riding into the wind is doing somewhere between 20 to 40% more work than the people who are riding directly behind them because they are digging right into that wind. And that's how those teammates can be very helpful. They can, build a sort of a protective envelope around their leader. There are all kinds of other things though, Matt. As you know, there's, they ferry food and water and drinks back and forth between the team cars that are trailing the race and bring those up to the team leaders and other teammates. They are chasing down attacks. You'll have another team go out and try to do something crazy on the day, and you'll send up a teammate ahead of the road to make sure that they don't get too far away. There's all kinds of surveillance and protection, I think, that is what they basically are doing. And that race within the race is really interesting to me. And I think that, as you said, there is a huge amount of strategy. The main thing for any sort of yellow jersey contender is that no bad days. That's the real thing, Matt, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want to have the really ugly day, whether it's you're just physically worn out, you bonk, as you said, which is, basically you're running at some sort of calorie or sugar or carb deficit, and just your body.
Phil Liggett says the yellow jersey has cracked. You never want to hear that about yourself, right?
You don't want that. And obviously, cycling is a dangerous sport also. And I don't need to tell you that. And there's, people fall off their bikes, they crash, they collide into each other. Sometimes they are lucky enough to be able to pick themselves right back up and get on their bike. Other times they are not. And that kind of bad luck, changes the race all the time. It is a fact of life in bike racing that stuff happens. So what you're really trying to avoid is having a bad day. Now, you obviously want to have some good days. You want to have multiple good days too. But the most important thing is to make sure that you don't have that one hard day where you just lose so much time that you fall out of contention. And so that is where the strategy really comes in terms of how much effort you're putting into the race, what places you're focusing your energy on, and how you sort of ration the energy of your bike race leaders. And I know I'm talking a little bit too much here, Matt, but I will say that one of the ways in which the sport has changed in the last handful of years is that it's become a little less cautious. And I don't know if that's a function of viewer fatigue, fan fatigue, or just a new generation of rider that is a little less conservative about effort. And Pogačar is the master class of this. He is a guy who is going out and kind of banging his head against the wall as hard as possible almost every single day. Caution be damned. And it has utterly changed the sport, made it more exciting, in my opinion, to not have riders who are kind of riding cautiously, protectively, trying to hold on to something, versus somebody who's trying to go out and grab it and be aggressive and define the race, take the race to the opponent. And that's the way that the sport has evolved in the last, 5 to 6 years. And I think it's really exciting.
It is really, really exciting. The other thing that's really exciting to watch is what we call a breakaway. And we'll see these over and over and over the course of the race. And obviously the goal, if you're watching it, is if you're in the breakaway, right, you want to create separation between yourself and what we call the peloton. And I should mention, if you, again, for folks who haven't paid close attention, at the beginning of the tour, you've got like 184 riders that are in that peloton. So it is a huge group of people that are all racing either for their own victories or in support of a team leader. And so it's a huge group. It atrophies over the course of the tour because people will crash, they'll get injured. There's time requirements. So if you fall too far off of the back of the group time, then you can be dropped. You can be cut out of the tour. But 184 riders, you try to get to the front of that group. You'll have a group of folks that'll break away, create separation that can be, in some cases, as much, believe it or not, as 10, 12 minutes, sometimes even more, between that breakaway group and the overall what we call the peloton, which is the main group of riders that are riding together. Talk a little bit about, just as while we're on that topic of strategy, about what's going on in that dynamic during the breakaway and what those riders are trying to do.
Well, they're trying to break away, literally, man. I mean, they're trying to get away as fast as possible, and they're,
right.
If they're smart, they're collaborating with each other, even if they're on other teams, to try to rotate the effort in order to maximize their speed as a small group. The peloton that you described, to revisit my glory days as a terrible, slow, off the back, often dropped amateur bike racer, it still is a pretty thrilling experience, and it's one of the most exhilarating things to be part of. When you're in a race of 50, 60, 70, sometimes over 100 riders, and it almost becomes this kind of organism unto itself. You are protected from the wind. Oftentimes, you are going much faster in a group like that you ever would be able to on your own, or even with a group of 3 or 4 or 5 people. You never want to be at the back of that thing, what they call the mare's tail of a peloton, because that's the hardest place where you might fall off and you might get yourself into trouble. But you also, sometimes things were happening up the road. You had no idea what was going on. I mean, keep in mind, this was, very, very low level Cat 4 bike racing, which there are no automobiles or radios or anybody telling you or caring what you're doing, actually. And sometimes the race would split and people would be up the road and major things would be happening and you had no idea. Those dynamics actually do happen at the professional level. And so it's a really important thing, if you're interested at all in winning, and certainly winning the yellow jersey, for you to be on the front, up there in that sort of, first 10 to 25 riders in the race. And the other reason, frankly, and this, Matt, is safety.
Right.
Bad things happen in the middle of packs and pelotons. And even if it doesn't happen specifically to you, sometimes these crashes will split a race. I mean, much in the same way we see on the, rush hour, if there's a fender bender in the middle of the road, the people who are caught behind it, they might have nothing to do with the actual accident itself, but they're still going to have a very long day. And so that is really what puts the importance on being at the front of any kind of bike race.
Great analogy, by the way, with the being in traffic. And I myself can join you in the ranks of former amateur bike racers. That I was certainly never anything special, but raced my Cat 3-4 Masters road races, and then I raced cyclocross actually for a number of years after that. The first thing that shocked me was when the guys in front of me about mid peloton crashed right in front of me, and I was like slowing down to make sure they were okay, and all the riders were like sprinting ahead because they saw an opportunity to gain time on the guys that were on the ground. But that's a kind of an interesting experience.
At the end, Matt, you could at least say to everybody, I was just about to make my move when they crashed in front of me, right? That's what everyone
exactly.
did, right?
Yeah, Monday morning, everybody's like, "So what'd you do this weekend?" I'm like, "Dude, I was racing bikes. I don't know what you were doing, but I was a bike racer." So yeah, absolutely. You never want to be off the back and off the back of the peloton. That's a really, really long day in the saddle when you gotta play catch up. Certainly can relate to that. The other thing I can relate to is the excitement around the strategy that will be taking place in this year's tour. So let's talk, Jason, about this year's tour. You already talked about the idea that we're going to have this great battle between Jonas and Tadej. I totally agree. And some of the dynamics, I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting, and this has been the case for a number of years now, it feels like, is you've got Tadej Pogačar, which is it just always kind of feels like, yeah, he's got a good team around him. Adam Yates is there with him, but it always feels like he's kind of like this lone gunman doing his own thing. And then you've got Jonas Vingegaard in that team, which is Visma Lisa Bike. I mean, he's got Matteo Jorgensen, he's got Sepp Kuss on that team, Simon Yates is on that team, Wout van Aert, I'm a huge Wout van Aert fan on that team. So talk a little bit about just the team dynamics around both of those riders. You see it the way I do, that Tadej is going to be probably a little bit more on his own, and Jonas is going to be surrounded by this kind of army of really experienced tour riders.
So, I mean, I think the thing that is very fascinating about this year's race is that it's an incredible contrast of philosophies of cycling preparation and training. And Vingegaard, it's a modern, tactical, practical approach. It is team cycling. It is the idea that you carry as many people into the mountains as possible. You try to win a race, not in a single day, but in little bites and pieces over the course of 3 weeks. Pogačar, by contrast, is a very impulsive racer. He races differently day to day. He races sometimes differently hour to hour over the course of a race. He also is not lying in secret preparing for the Tour de France over the long winter and spring training season. He's going out and competing all the time. This guy has already had a giant cycling calendar. He has had multiple wins. Tadej Pogačar has had a season for the ages before he sets foot in France for this race. It is a real conflict or showdown between two completely opposing styles of preparing for the Tour de France. And I find that really fascinating. I truly do.
So much fun teeing up this year's tour with Jason Gay of the Wall Street Journal. Absolutely phenomenally interesting individual. The tour, of course, coming up on the 5th of July. And as I mentioned with Jason, so excited for that. Some things for our audience to keep an eye on as we reflect a little bit on what Jason told us to expect. We are going to have an incredible race this year. And I think barring a crash, barring something serious, barring somebody absolutely just running out of gas on a specific stage, what have you, barring the unexpected, it probably is going to come down to a cat fight, if you will. It's going to come down to a wrestling match between those two riders. Tadej Pogačar, the Slovenian, riding for this year UAE Team Emirates XRG, will be Tadej's team. Jonas Vingegaard was the other rider that we talked about quite a bit. He is from Denmark, riding for Visma Lisa Bike. And those two gentlemen, they're incredible bike racers. They're incredible strategists in terms of thinking through how they can get that edge, how they can get that extra couple seconds on every stage. I guarantee, assuming they're both healthy throughout the tour, you are going to see the two of them battling up such climbs as Mount Ventoux. I know we've got the Col de Tourmalet on the tour this year. We have the finish at Col de la Luz in one of the stages. I believe that is stage 18. By the way, they're coming at that climb from a different side, from the east side, which they've never done before. That's going to be a fascinating stage of the race. So as we get into what we call the Pyrenees, that's a mountain range, of course. As we get into the Alps, that's kind of both of those in the second half of the tour. That is where, assuming these two riders are still within hailing distance of each other, we are going to see things get really interesting. There are a few other riders to keep our eyes on. One of them would be Matteo Jorgensen. Matteo is actually an American. He grew up in Walnut Creek, California. And as I mentioned with Jason, my son, was a bike racer, actually at a fairly high level, racing for the Trek junior development team when he was racing in high school and actually all the way back to middle school. Raced against Matteo. We saw Matteo race at junior nationals several years in a row. Matteo was an absolute beast in those days and still is. He's somebody to keep our eye on. He's riding for Visa Melissa Bike as well. And as I mentioned with Jason, quite a number of riders, incredible riders on that team, including the likes of Wout van Aert. Wout is an incredible rider from Belgium, came out of the cyclocross world. So he was a cyclocross rider before he took to the road. And he's been a contender, a great sprinter, a solid climber. He's going to be right there alongside Jonas, as will, as we suggested, Simon Yates and some other really, really good. It's going to be a fun tour for us to watch. You're going to want to watch all of those different races going on along the way. So you've got the yellow jersey, the polka dot jersey. You've got Tadej Pogačar, Remco Evenepoel, Richard Carapaz, a rider we haven't spoken about. EF Education rider. He could certainly contend on some of those polka dot jersey climbs, and Jonas Vingegaard, of course, will be right there. Green jersey. Jasper Philipsen is probably the number one rider. Alpecin de Koenig, he's probably going to be the favorite to win the green, but we will see as we get a little bit closer to the start of the Tour de France. And that white rider, that white jersey rider, that could be anybody's game. Some other things to keep our eyes on as we're kind of focusing on the world of STEM and technical education. So many things going on within bike racing. We talked about the strategy. Think about this, though. We've got 21 stages all over France, starting in Lille, which is in the north part of France, finishing on the Champs-Élysées, which is in Paris. It's absolutely stunning to watch the finish of the Tour de France, by the way. It did not finish in Paris last year for the first time ever, at least in modern history. It finished in Nice, France, as opposed to Paris. And the reason for that was because we were preparing in Paris for the 2024 Olympic Games. And so they changed the finish to a different spot. We'll be back on the Champs-Élysées. We'll be back in Paris for the final stage of the Tour this year. That is usually a gentleman's stage, by the way. You usually don't attack the yellow jersey on the final stage. So the entire Tour should be figured out by the end of stage 20. Now let's talk a little bit about what's going on. We've got communication. We have communication between riders. So if you're a domestique, Jason talked about the role of that, somebody who's literally serving the lead rider. You'll find people dropping back out of the peloton during the race to go back to their team car, this group of cars that are following the peloton through France to pick up nutrition. They're picking up water bottles. They're picking up energy bottles. They're picking up energy bars, all kinds of science that goes into what these riders are eating and drinking while they're competing in the Tour. So when you think about it, your body is a machine. We're burning calories. If we burn in excess of calories, we do what we call bonk. We run out of energy. We hit the wall, and really bad things can happen when we bonk in a bike race. And so we want to make sure that the riders are staying fueled while they're on the bike and also once they're off the bike. So you finish a stage, you can imagine just the incredible, grueling torture that you put your body through in a stage of the Tour de France. Some of these as long as 131 miles. I think the most vertical in any stage is the one up the Col de Tourmalet. At least that's the finish. 5,048 vertical meters. So think about climbing 15,000 feet on a bike over the course of a stage. In that case, that's 183 kilometers long. So a little over 100 miles, maybe 110 miles, give or take. Your body's absolutely spent and you've got to now refuel, you've got to recover, you've got to get carbs into your body, you've got the right mix of protein into the body. That is a whole science. These teams travel with their own chefs. They travel with their own nutritionists. They are figuring out how many calories along the way, before, after, what we're eating after the stage, what we're eating for breakfast, all of that science that goes into the Tour de France. We've got this whole idea of strategy. So Jason was talking about that. If you're riding on your team, you're trying to do what they call cover a rider. So you're watching, if you're a rider, for example, the team lead on your team is in the yellow jersey, and you've got a group of team members that are around protecting that yellow jersey, and all of a sudden you see another GC contender go off the front unexpectedly, or try to position themselves for a sprint unexpectedly. So now you're trying to figure out, how do we cover that rider? So you're watching other riders, watching their numbers. You've got, if you're a rider in the peloton, you're riding for a specific team leader, you are looking at those other riders, you're tracking their numbers, you're knowing who they are. So if you see somebody make a move in the race, you're able to cover that move. You're also communicating with each other, and you're communicating with your team car. So you've got a radio in your head. It's called race radio. Your team director is riding in a car behind you, most likely, and they are directing you in the race. So as they're getting feedback from what's happening inside the peloton, inside the breakaway, what riders are doing what, they are strategizing. They're giving feedback to their riders in real time. There's all that communication technology that's taking place over the course of the ride. Now let's talk about the bikes and the equipment. And this is just incredible, incredible technology. So you've got carbon fiber bikes. They weigh, I've actually got a really high-end carbon fiber race bike. The whole bike weighs about 16 pounds. So you've got incredible technology that goes into design, to aerodynamics. What is that frame design? How do we maximize strength and minimize weight? And that goes through the frame, the bars, the seat post, what we call Grupo. So your Grupo is the combination of your drivetrain, so your chain ring on the front, your cassette, which is the back. So the front sprocket we call a chain ring. The sprockets in back on the rear wheel, those are called your cassette. You've got all these gearing ratios that are taking place, understanding those gearing ratios, building that componentry in a lightweight fashion. We're now using disc brakes on bikes in the Tour de France, and that's only been the last several years that they've allowed disc brakes. They stop the bike incredibly quickly, and if you're not careful using disc brakes, you can get yourself into a whole lot of trouble. Imagine someone stopping unexpectedly at the front or inside the peloton and then piling everybody up behind them. That can be very dangerous, and so especially if you're doing for instance, a descent. Sometimes these riders are descending at 55, 60 miles an hour, or even faster, believe it or not, on a bike with a wheel that, back in my day was maybe 21 millimeters wide. Now they're riding wheels that are tires that are more like 28 to 30 millimeters wide, but incredibly, incredibly crazy descents. And so with these disc brakes, the ability to slow down and stop the bike very, very quickly, we've got to be careful, but also all kinds of technology that goes into the disc brakes and into your shifters and so on. So all this technology that's taking place, you'll see during the time trials, we've got different skin suits, we've got different helmets, that's all around aerodynamics. We've got different bikes, as a matter of fact. You'll see the riders leaning out over the front of their bike on what we call aero bars. So they're in a very aerodynamic position. The whole idea in a time trial is to minimize the coefficient of drag, is what they call it. So you're reducing your coefficient of drag to the absolute minimum so that you're slicing through the air and you're creating the minimum amount of resistance on your body and on your bike and maximizing every single ounce, every single watt of power, I should say, that goes into the bike and making sure that that is being used to maximum efficiency. I mentioned this term called watts, and that is the way we measure the power that a bike rider is putting out on their bike. And so these riders, by the way, a good casual rider, you're going out for a ride, you may average, I don't remember anymore, 140, 150 watts, something like that, maybe a little bit higher. Some of these riders are like well into the 300 and 400 watts in some cases for sustained lengths of time. And so there's all this technology that goes into measuring their watts, measuring their energy, measuring their power throughout the race, understanding how much energy they're using up of their own energy and so on, how they're replenishing all those calories, all kinds of technology that goes into that. We're not done with the technology yet. The pace cars, the team cars, obviously all kinds of tech going on there. The way that we track the race over the course of the tour. Think about a 131-mile race from point to point, and we've got helicopters, we've got video going on. All of that is going back to a TV network. You've got the folks. I love watching the tour, by the way, on Peacock. Every single stage, Bob Roll and Phil Leggett historically, and I believe again this year we'll be calling the tour. So they're getting all this feedback and they're analyzing the tour. Then you get into the broadcast booth where they've got all this really cool technology that shows exactly what's happening in the race. It's almost like a table with the riders riding on the table, all done using some version of augmented reality. And so you're watching actually the race unfold in real time on a table in the broadcast booth, so that those the individuals that are explaining the race, calling the race for the audience, are able to explain the incredible things that are going on inside of that race. So from a tech ed standpoint, from a STEM standpoint, all of the things we teach in technical education, all of the things we teach in STEM, whether it's aerodynamics, whether it's friction, whether it's physics, whether it's speed, whether it's mechanical drives, all of these things are available as examples for our students to learn about the great things happening in the Tour de France. It's going to be a really interesting tour, and it's going to be interesting, I think, for us to see who wins the overall GC. I will make a prediction. I think you have to go with Tadej Pogačar for all the reasons that Jason was mentioning. He is a beast. He is an incredible rider, and I think until somebody dethrones him, he's got to be your favorite. But I would say Jonas Vingegaard, depending on how the race unfolds, would be a close second. Other riders to keep our eyes on. Primož Roglič, he's now 35 years old. He's the one that in 2020 thought had at least the audience, I thought, the world of cycling thought had the Tour in the bag. And as it turns out, Tadej Pogačar, today's reigning champion, was able to kind of snatch victory from the jaws of Primož Roglic's victory anyway, and take the Tour there in the final stages. But he's somebody to keep an eye on. He's not out of it. We mentioned Remco Evenepoel. He's had a really good season so far, an amazing climber. You may see him actually contending for some of those climbing stages. And if he can get a gap for one reason or another, maybe we find a day that Vingegaard and Pogačar don't quite have it, there's always a possibility that he could get a gap, or another rider could get a gap, especially on some of those climbing stages, and maybe hang on to that throughout the Tour. It's going to be great. It's going to be so much fun to watch. It was fun for me to kind of break down and explain the Tour to our audience side by side with Jason Gay, a gentleman for whom I have tremendous respect, from the Wall Street Journal. It was fun to give you here on the second half of this episode of the podcast a little bit of what I think is happening in the Tour and a little bit why it's so fascinating for STEM and technical education. It's coming up on July 5th, and I would tell you it is a great sport to get hooked on. I hope we drew several of you in, at least tune in for those first few stages. Listen to this top part of the episode once more so that you're familiar with what's going on. It's going to be a phenomenal 3 weeks, 21 stages on the Tour de France this year. So fun to break it down for the audience of the Tech Ed podcast, and hope you enjoyed this explanation of a sport that you can tell is very, very near and dear to my heart, that of course being the sport of cycling. We will be back with you every single week of the Tour, not to talk about the Tour, but to bring you the absolute best in STEM and technical education here on the Tech Ed podcast as we continue to secure the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. We'll throw some resources up in the show notes for you, so be sure to check out the show notes. Let's put those at techedpodcast.com/Jason Gay. That's techedpodcast.com/JASONGAY. And check that out when you're all done at the show notes. Always come find us on social media. You can find us all over Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook. Wherever you go for social, you will find the Tech Ed Podcast. When you're there, say hello and be sure to tune in next week. Until then, I'm your host, Matt Kirchner, and this is the Tech Ed Podcast.